Jeff Durkin with We Are Change Connecticut out here in New York City, and we're joined by an awesome journalist, Ben Anderson. Ben, thanks for the interview. And first, tell us about your career for starting getting off in journalism. What kind of propelled you into getting involved in this with media and all that?
I think I started when I was 17, 18 years old, discovered books and thought the answer to everything was in books. I read fanatically, and strangely it was Martin Luther King's biography and then Malcolm X's autobiography that made me think, there were struggles, there were interesting things I wanted to at least cover, maybe even be part of. But I was a white kid in a small town in England, so couldn't really do anything as part of the civil rights struggle in the 60s America, but started just consuming everything I could get my hands on. And the first big thing really was the Indonesian invasion of East Timor, and the fact that Britain, who at the time claimed to have an ethical foreign policy, was supplying the weapons to Indonesia that they were using when they invaded East Timor. I couldn't believe this was happening, and it was almost like wanting to go out on the streets and tell people this was happening, because I was so shocked it was happening, and so shocked that someone could claim to have an ethical foreign policy at the same time as selling weapons to a country that was invading East Timor and killing tens of thousands of people. So I think that's really what got me started, and I started writing a few probably very bad articles about Indonesia and East Timor, didn't get published, and eventually found someone who needed someone to go undercover as a documentary maker. I'd never really even considered TV or documentary making. I wanted to write. But my first job was 6 months undercover as an undertaker, filming all the scams and abuses that go on in the funeral trade, which was becoming very corporate at the time, but still does have the public's trust. And I just thought, I worked alone for 6 months undercover with a very small secret camera, and it just felt like the perfect medium for me. So I did undercover journalism for 3-4 years, and then finally got a chance to go out and do, normal documentaries. And someone at the BBC saw something I'd done and liked it and asked me to come up with some ideas for my own series. And I was just really struggling to work out exactly what I wanted to do that I could also persuade the BBC to back me on. And George Bush made his Axis of Evil speech. So I said, why don't you let me go to all 6 countries that George Bush has called evil? There was an A list and a B list. The A list was Iran, Iraq, North Korea. The B list was Cuba, Syria, Libya. I went to all 6 countries on a tourist visa and just filmed, real life there, which was obviously the exact opposite of what Bush at the time was saying about many of those countries. We called it Holidays in the Axis of Evil. And it was slightly contrarian in a slightly humorous way, in quite a light way for current affairs, but it did really well, and that was it. I was pretty much allowed to do whatever I wanted from that point on. So covered conflicts all around the world until about 2007, 2008, and then 2007 was my first trip to Afghanistan. And like Iran or Iraq or Israel-Palestine, Afghanistan was one of the most stark examples of a situation where you just spend a bit of time on the ground and go away from the hotel in the capital where all the journalists are staying, or go away from the big military base where the news crews often stay, and what you see is the exact opposite of what you're being told is happening, and that's just where I want to be, and that's where what I want to be doing.
And then just fast forward into your documentary about Afghanistan, which was really good. I encourage people to check it out. This is what winning looks like. Get into that a little bit, just kind of the background on that, whatever you could talk about otherwise, and just to feel, what did you feel first before, because you went to Afghanistan before, but what was your expectation before you went over there?
That was the culmination of 12 trips to southern Afghanistan, where the war has always been fiercest, and this is what winning looks like is actually a quote from General Allen on his last day in Afghanistan. He said, "The future is the Afghan security forces that we've funded and trained, continue to fund, don't continue to train. The future is them pushing back the Taliban, spreading governance amongst the Afghan people. This is what winning looks like. This is victory, and we should not shrink from using those words." And I thought, I've seen a lot of training of the Afghan police and army, and it's nowhere near as glorious as he thinks it's going to be. So I went to Sangin in Helmand province, the most violent district in Afghanistan's most violent province, which had just been handed over to the Afghan security forces. And I knew it was going to be bad, but I had no idea how bad it was going to be. Without exaggeration, the police there were many drug abusers within the police. I mean, so high on patrol and on watch that they couldn't even stand up at times, smoking heroin, kidnapping civilians for $3,000 a pop, selling the weapons and fuel we were supplying them with, abducting, raping, and in some cases murdering young boys from the local community. And when me and a very brave US Marine major who was punished for his actions, not punished, his report was downgraded. I mean, it harmed his career significantly. So me and the very brave US Marine major confronted the police chief about this abuse and murder of young boys, and he pretty much justified it, and pretty much said, my men had to go through the same thing when they were young. Now they're collecting the debt that is owed to them, and said, if my men don't have sex with those young boys, who should they have sex with? But in much, much worse language than that. So that is what winning looks like in Afghanistan. That's what we're handing over to. And my fear is, and certainly I think this is true in the South, that all we've done in 12 years is hand over to a bunch of guys and a government and a set of security forces who, in some cases, are as bad as the warlords were, in the early 90s. So bad that people welcomed the Taliban and thought, well, at least they're just Muslims. At least they'll provide us with some semblance of security and justice. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing in southern Afghanistan now.
And I think it shows too really well in that documentary when you mentioned the Marine that you went with him to confront the police chief on. It really shows just how his tenacity to try to and expose what's going on. But then meanwhile you have like a lower level ambassador showing up and getting all the good reports instead of getting the real story from him. And describe that for people who that's seen.
Not a lower level, but the ambassador, the American ambassador and the British ambassador turned up, and people in the Foreign Office have admitted this to me since. All they wanted to do was the photo op of, we visited the once insurgent hotbed of Sangin and saw firsthand the brilliant work the police are doing. They actually put out a press release the next day saying that. What they did was land in the base. In Afghanistan, you can land on the forward operating bases, the FOBs, the big military bases, and be perfectly safe. They did that. They walked 100 meters within the base, had a briefing where they were told how brilliantly things were going. Major Stuber, the major who was battling the child abuse, wasn't allowed to speak. And then they left, and they granted me a very quick interview, and I said, you realise that in this area the police are considered to be the bad guys? And they said, I think you're completely wrong. I've spoken to people who are out patrolling with the police every single day, and they tell me the police are doing a brilliant job. And I tried to say, you haven't spoken to anybody who goes out patrolling with the police. You've spoken to the people who never leave the base and have been stopped from speaking to the guy who goes out on patrol regularly with the police. But they weren't willing to listen. They just, I think it's emblematic of what's happening in Afghanistan now, which is the only thing we're seriously committed to, is making it look good to the people at home, making it look like it wasn't all for nothing. And that's it. In terms of our original goals for Afghanistan, I don't think there's any serious commitment to them whatsoever. And if we leave 10,000 troops behind, that's, of those 10,000, 1,500 roughly will actually be able to go out and do things. The others will be in a supporting role, and that's enough to look after special forces teams who are going to be going after senior Al-Qaeda or Taliban leaders or calling in drone strikes and nothing else. The idea that we're going to build the Afghan government security forces and are committed to serious reconstruction and development, I'm afraid is long gone.
And I think it shows with your reporting as well as others about just really showing how when you really go out in the field like what you did, instead of getting the typical press release and the typical tour from the generals and the interviews, it really shows just what really is going on. And have you seen that change a little bit more from your experience, or is it kind of increasing related with your work or with others?
I don't know if it's changing that much. I mean, there are some brilliant photographers and brilliant journalists who really go out there and see what's going on, but there are still so many who think it's acceptable to go to these forward operating bases, put on a flak jacket, do some live pieces to camera with a helicopter in the background, so it looks like they're on the front line, get an interview with a general who says things are going brilliantly, the Taliban are almost finished, and then leave. And I think that's actually worse than not going at all, because it gives the impression you've seen something yourself and you agree with what the general's saying. You know, you're not testing his claims at all. So I don't know. I mean, a country like Afghanistan, you know, I did a film, just did a film about Sudan. It's Shane Smith, the owner of Vice, has a very good analogy. He says often watching sort of the news media in the US is like watching 10-year-old kids play soccer. You know, there's this huge pitch and the ball moves around the pitch and this whole group of people just follow the ball. Except I think you can take that one step further. There are some areas of the pitch where they'd never go, or they very rarely go. So I don't know, I'm not that optimistic. I'm very worried that we're at a stage now where people in power will realise there are some people who are able and willing to report what's really happening in places. And their readership or viewership is a very small chunk of the American population. So people can make claims which they know are going to get torn apart in the New Yorker or the New Republic, or you know, on some of the new companies that are opening now, and they'll take that. They'll take 5 or 10% of the population knowing they're bullshitting, if that speech gets them the votes of, you know, 40, 50, 60% of the rest of the population. And I think that's a very, very disturbing trend, because I don't see how it changes really. And I don't see any evidence that it's getting better, and I see some evidence actually that it's getting worse. I mean, even Afghanistan, where America still has troops, it's just not really part of the conversation here. Even in New York, you walk around and it you know, obviously because of what I do, it comes up in conversation when I meet people, and it's just not on people's radars at all. And that's a country where there are still American troops. So try talking about Sudan or Congo or places like that. It's I don't know. I'm very worried for the future. When I first started doing this, I really believed that books and articles and documentaries really could change things. And certainly in Britain, when I was a teenager, you know, if John Pilger or Michael Burke did a documentary about Cambodia or about the famine in Ethiopia, it felt like half the country was watching, and it felt like questions would be asked in Parliament the next day about it, and things might actually change. And I'm not sure. I think maybe those days are gone, and gone for good, unfortunately.
And you mentioned one of the stories that also related to Sudan. You just came out, there was an HBO last night for a new documentary. Tell people about that, viewers about that, and kind of the background on how you, you know, went over there, and then what your experiences were like covering that issue.
I mean, I think Sudan is one of the most startling examples of how the media and the general public can really seem to be engaged with an issue. I mean, it felt then like everyone, Republican, Democrat, you know, wanted to do something about Bashir. And yet 5 years on, the situation is getting worse on the ground. 500,000 new refugees in the last 12 months alone. The same guy dropping the same bombs on the same people. And yet, when was the last time you heard Sudan in the press? I mean, South Sudan was mentioned because there's a civil war there. South Sudan was mentioned when it was created as you know, as a separate country, but Sudan itself and Darfur and Bashir, you know, an indicted war criminal. When was the last time you even heard that mentioned? And I can remember George Clooney, Angelina Jolie, Don Cheadle. I remember that getting massive attention, and yet somehow the situation continues exactly as it was then, and people just stop paying attention. So I went there, I went to the refugee camps in eastern Chad, where because money is running out, their rations have been cut by more than half. So whereas the refugees, many of whom have spent their entire lives in those refugee camps, were living on 2,100 calories a day, they're now living on 900 calories a day. So lots of babies are malnourished, babies are dying there in the refugee camps. Then we went into Sudan itself, where there are several major rebel groups who had fought each other in the past. They've now formed an alliance, and they say they're going to march on Khartoum and try and take down Bashir themselves. And you know, they're rebels. It's going to be chaotic. It's going to be bloody, and who knows what will happen afterwards. And I think it's shameful that the only way something is done about Bashir is them taking it into their own hands, with, you know, who knows how many thousands of people being killed in what happens next.
And then just looking back on the places you've been and the issues you've covered, what one story sticks out to you in the best way? I'm sure you can name several of them, but kind of just boil it down if you want. Just any one example about, you know, just one issue that really kind of just stuck out to you.
I mean, Afghanistan's been sort of my main story for the last 6 or 7 years, and there was a piece by a writer from the Brookings Institution recently, and he'd been given, and he said it's a tour sponsored by the US military and the State Department. And I don't know how he did it, went to 10 or 11 provinces in 6 or 7 days. So must have literally gone on a helicopter from forward operating base to forward operating bases and was given briefings. I mean, you can't go out and see what's actually happening, but wrote a pretty glowing report about how bright the future looks, and how most people are actually getting Afghanistan wrong. I mean, a shocking piece of academia, I don't know what you'd even call it, which can't have been based on any evidence he'd actually seen himself. And you know, the generals and the PAOs in Afghanistan have got a long record of really spinning what's happening there. So that's probably the main example of just on the rare occasions when it's covered, what's being said is so far away from the truth. And you know, the Bo Bergdahl prisoner exchange recently, some of the things that just became part of the discussion about that. You know, we've swapped 5 terrorists for a US POW, and you look into their records, and actually 3 of those guys handed themselves in 2001 and said, we will support the government of President Hamid Karzai. Had we have taken that deal back then, and I think the majority of the Taliban were willing to do a deal back then, which is what we're trying to do now after 12 years of fighting. You know, now we'd love to have a deal with the Taliban before we withdraw. Had we have taken that deal back then, I think Afghanistan could have been a radically different country today. And for a tiny fraction, like 1% of the military budget, we could have done so much to help Afghanistan. And yet, not only is that not mentioned in the media at all, these guys have become terrorists who are somehow going to now be free to attack America in exchange for a deserter. And it's, when you hear so many commentators on so many news stations making these claims without anyone questioning them, it's very frustrating.
For people to check out the new documentary on HBO or any of the other work that you'd like to mention, just websites, anything else you'd like to add, for people to check out your work, and then any other websites or anything else you'd like to add.
Yeah, I did 3 films for the HBO series, The Drug Traffickers of Rio, The Houthi Rebels of Yemen, and then last night's episode, The Forgotten Genocide in Sudan. This is what winning looks like is available on the Vice website, just vice.com. And then in a couple of weeks I've got a film coming out about the Afghan interpreters who are now facing death threats from the Taliban and who can't get visas. And that's a really powerful film. And one interpreter who I spent 5 weeks working with actually said, look, I've seen the American people, I've spent a lot of time with American soldiers, I know they're good guys, I know they're not corrupt, they will review my case and give me a visa, I'm sure, otherwise I'll be beheaded if I stay in Afghanistan. And just seeing the faith of guys like that is astounding. So yeah, that's coming out on June 23rd.
Journalism is changing, but it's changing for the better, and it's a revolutionary time for journalists, because you can just pick up a smartphone or a small camera and head out and change the world, and it's an exciting and inspiring time, so hang in there.
Without grassroots media, without citizen journalism, we will not be able to take back the media. We have to make the corporate media irrelevant and take things in our own hands, and I applaud your guys' efforts, and I applaud everyone who's doing similar things, because this is really the revolution right here.